because you know that you're going to get more than $10,000 if you win, even if your client was in a situation for a very short period of time. However, which of these damages are trebled? There is no answer. It is not in the statute. And in the case that I'm going to talk to you guys about in a moment, we got actual or economic damages and compensatory damages trebled, but we got that because the defendants were asleep at the wheel and never challenged it. And if I had been defending that case, I don't know if it would have come out the same way. Attorneys' fees and costs, obviously, great. And uniquely in California law, expert witness fees, which are normally not recoverable under the normal fee statutes. Cases. I've only listed one because there's only one appellate case, and it's unreported. Civil case. And this was my case. The case is misspelled in Lexis. It was actually TJIA was the defendant's last name. It's in there as Tija, Tija. And I just want to talk really briefly about this case because it will give you sort of a sense of the kinds of cases. This is the only thing on Lexis. So when you are either serving as a victim's attorney in a criminal prosecution or if you're thinking about bringing a civil case, this is the thing that's going to pop up. I recently was on the phone with a prosecutor in one of our cases, and he was telling me about the case, and I was like, yeah, I know that case, actually, and I think that you should use it and see if you can get something published in a different case. This involved an Indonesian woman who was in some ways not what I think in popular culture would be considered a typical trafficking victim. And one of the lessons of the case is that there isn't really a typical trafficking victim. She was quite educated. She'd had not just high school, but college education in Indonesia. And she had worked for many years as a nanny in Saudi Arabia for an American family living there. Went back to Indonesia and couldn't find work because, as is so often the case, it's really hard for a woman in her 40s to get a job in Indonesia. She accepted a job with a family in Los Angeles in a wealthy suburb called La Cañada and came over here as a domestic servant. She was brought by the father of the husband of the family. It was a husband and wife. President of a bank was his job. And she was told to work without pay. Very classic facts told, we're Christian and Buddhist, you're Muslim, you're a terrorist, you can't go to mosque, we don't trust you, we have to keep your passport. Also, you're dark-skinned and everybody hates you for that. If you go outside, you are very likely to be raped. You can't trust anybody. If the police come, by the way, you're illegal, which you didn't know. And if the police come, they're going to deport you. You will be put in prison where you will almost certainly be raped, possibly starved, beaten, and deported, if not imprisoned for the rest of your life. So one of the interesting dynamics of this case is my client was not stupid, right? And she wanted out from the beginning. And there is an interplay between the idea of somebody who gets out early, right? How is that trafficking? And that was something that the defendants said. Well, this isn't a case where she didn't know that, she had no idea that these things were untrue and blah, 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 blah. She actually didn't know that some of those things were untrue. She didn't know whether she would be raped if she left the house. She had no familiarity with this country. She didn't really speak English at all at the time. But she did try to escape, and she tried to escape starting early on. She was not always, or the family wasn't always at home. She was sometimes alone. And this is, again, a common fact in domestic worker cases. She tried to escape 3 times. She saw that workers were working across the street. She ran from the home and asked them to take her to the Indonesian consulate, or embassy, she said. And they didn't know where it was. And they spoke very little English, and she spoke very little English. And it was a disaster, and she went back to the house. A couple weeks later, there was a plumber outside working on a neighboring house, and she ran to him and asked to use his cell phone. She called the only American person that she knew, an older woman who didn't understand who it was, and hung up. And she went back to the house. And finally, she got up the courage to call from inside the house because, of course, she had been instructed not to. Called the same woman, finally understood who it was, put her in touch with her own daughter. The daughter said the police are going to come, or the FBI is going to come and help you. You'll recognize them by the FBI on their jackets. The FBI didn't, of course, come. They sent the sheriffs. So when the sheriffs arrived, she didn't see FBI on the jackets and said, no, there's no problem here. Luckily, one of the sheriff's deputies who was there got what was going on, got on the phone with the American woman who had helped facilitate it, and ultimately the client was convinced to leave the home. Part of the reason for telling that very lengthy story is people don't get out very easily. It's not simply a matter of picking up the phone and calling. And this is something that juries have to understand if you're going to do a civil case, because many times they don't. She was less than a mile from a major commercial strip with stores and restaurants. And one thing that we found in mock juries is that people had a really hard time understanding, first of all, if the family's not there, why don't you walk out? Why don't you go down the street and ask for help? And so this is all part of creating that narrative about a person in her shoes and what she believed and what she felt at that time. She was only there for 2 months. Her actual damages were about $13,000 for wages, and she got that in restitution in a parallel criminal action. However, in the civil case, she got, with the trebling of the actual damages and the compensatory damages, she got about $257,000 plus $500,000 in punitive damages. At the end of the halfway through trial, she wanted to quit. This is a story about professional dominance and exerting it and when it's appropriate to do so. I drove to her and begged her to get in my car and drove to the courthouse. And I still to this day don't know. I mean, it turned out okay. We won. But was that a great thing to do as a lawyer and human being to a woman who was saying, I've had enough, I can't show up and face these people again? I don't know, to this day. Be prepared for that in these cases. When the jury announced the verdict, her first question was, is this enough money for me to buy a car? It turns out that it is, but she didn't get it, right? Because just as Martina was saying, there are huge problems in collecting. The week after the verdict comes down, the family transfers all of its bank accounts to the husband's father in Indonesia. We file a fraudulent transfer action. We serve him in Indonesia. We retain a pro bono firm in Singapore where the husband has gone to work to pursue collection against him there. And ultimately the case settled for a confidential amount. But it required filing 2 separate actions after winning the jury verdict to get money in her pocket. Under intense family pressure, she did some things with that money, including buying property in Indonesia that I would not have recommended and, in fact, begged her not to do. And so now she is, again, working in situations that I wouldn't want to see her working in, even if they don't rise to the level of trafficking. And this is another lesson, unfortunately, that I have for you, is that a lot of these cases turn into lifelong cases with lifelong clients. This particular client did actually feel empowered by the process. She became active in a survivors caucus, but she's still working for very low wages and in conditions that I think are problematic to this day. Importance of the civil remedy, really briefly, dignity and control. I think that you guys have already heard about the burden of proof issue in criminal prosecutions. There are a lot of cases that I think are super strong civil cases that I'm glad are not being brought criminally because I believe in beyond a reasonable doubt. And how are you going to establish beyond a reasonable doubt if the whole point of the confinement of your client was that she never see anyone else, so there are no witnesses? One problem that I have had a lot in terms of criminal prosecutions is criminal prosecutions for visa fraud. Formally a victimless crime. The victim is the state. That's what happens in almost all of the cases that I've done civilly that have had criminal prosecutions parallel to them. They have not been for trafficking violations. So there are a lot more cases than the ones in Martina's database that have trafficking facts out there, but there are a lot of cases that are simply prosecuted as visa fraud or other sort of immigration violations. And not only is visa fraud, by the way, a victimless crime, technically, I mean, in the formal sense of that crime, your client is complicit. That does not reflect the facts of any of my clients.